Dan Senor is the host of the Call Me Back podcast. If you listen to me at all, you know that Dan's podcast is probably the most influential source for news on Israel's seven front war for an American audience that there exists. And his latest episode is with Douglas Murray, who's the new Christopher Hitchens. And so I cannot wait for the show to be done today because I'm going to go out and immediately do my 9 miles and listen to Dan talking to Douglas Murray. Just give us a little preview of that episode. Dan, welcome. Good morning. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, hey, Douglas. Hey, Hugh. Good morning. Good to be with you. Look, I can't believe I'm saying this, but we are steps away, really days away from the 1 year anniversary of October 7th. I just couldn't imagine when October 7th happened that we'd still be talking about the war a year from October 7th. I didn't expect there to still be hostages, Israeli hostages, American hostages in the dungeons of Gaza a year from that moment. And here we are. And I wouldn't have imagined that Israel would basically be in a multi-front war a year from October 7th. And like I said, here we are. So what I wanted to do is have a series of conversations with some of the voices that have influenced me the most since October 7th over the past year, the voices I've relied on, and have not the normal news of the day conversations. You know, what happened in southern Lebanon? What happened at Rafah? What happened? What's the latest debate on the Philadelphia corridor? I want to pull back from the day to day and have a bigger picture conversation with what I think are some of the most keen and most insightful thinkers and protagonists in the story since October 7th, and have them talk about the lessons they've learned, what it's taught them about Israel and Israel's struggle, what it's taught them about the Middle East, what it's taught them about the U.S., what they've learned about Western civilization, and the threats to Western civilization, and where all this is going. And so I'm releasing a series of these conversations, both on podcast and on video, and Douglas was the first one.
Well, I cannot wait to listen to that. I know you're doing live events as well, and I want you to tell people where they can come and hear those live events before I go to my question set.
Yeah, so on September 24th in New York City, I'm doing an event at the Stryker Center, which is at a synagogue in New York, Temple Emmanuel, with Amir Tibon, who's a journalist for Haaretz, who has an extraordinary story from October 7th. He was living in a kibbutz near the south in southern Israel with his wife and his 2 little kids. The kibbutz became overrun by Hamas. He was hiding in what they call in Hebrew the mamad, which is like their bomb shelter or safe room. And he contacted his father, who's a legendary Israeli army general, retired, and his father, who lives up in central Israel, basically drove down and ultimately saved his son and his grandchildren. It's an extraordinary story of what his father experienced along the way, what he experienced during that day. And then because he's a journalist, who I don't agree with all the time, by the way, on issues, but because he is an actual journalist, he's also been covering the war. So he not only was a victim of the war, he's been covering the war. And so we're having a live conversation on September 24th on the date of the release of his book, which is about his October 7th story and then what has followed. His October 7th story was featured on 60 Minutes. And then, and so we're going to do a live podcast at the Stryker Center. You can purchase tickets. You just go to the Stryker Center website and you'll search for events, Senor, Senor, or Tibon, Tibon. That's on September 24th. And actually tonight, I am in Philadelphia. I'm doing an event with Dave McCormick, who is a close personal friend and is also running for the U.S. Senate, as you know, and he's a combat veteran and a national security expert, and he went to Israel soon after October 7th. I helped him plan his trip. He and his wife, Dina Powell, went, I think, as early as January. So, before many Americans had been to Israel after October 7th, he was there, and he went down to southern Israel, to the Gaza envelope. He visited the kibbutzim. He met with families of hostages. He was right in there, shoulder to shoulder. He'd been to Israel earlier in his national security career, but never obviously as a civilian, certainly not in that context. And so he and I are doing an event tonight at 8 p.m. in the Philadelphia area. and it's a event open to the public. We're talking about Israel, the U.S.-Israel relationship, and details for that event are I tweeted it out. Maybe I'll send it to you, and you can if you want to post it.
I will.
If
I will.
people
I'm a big fan of Dave McCormick. He's on this show often weekly, and I hope Pennsylvania sends him to the Senate because we could use a veteran of the 82nd Airborne and the uh, the smarts that come from Wall Street. Dina, of course, a national security expert as well. Now, Dan, I want to begin. I have a bunch of questions. First question:
yeah.
I believe there is something called a Fauda effect in America. That is, for every American who watched Fauda, and I am one who watched every minute of the Israeli series about their most secret covert operators. I'm surprised that they've only been able to rescue as few as they have, but I'm also surprised that Americans don't understand the risk of tunnels under the Philadelphia corridor because when Netanyahu said last week we don't want him going to Iran, that was season 4. Gabby, who's a character that Daron lost in Paris, the danger is he's going to end up in Iran, and they'll do anything to stop him from getting to Iran. So, would you explain to people why that resonates with Israelis and why Netanyahu is perhaps stressing that as a risk?
So if you look at Gaza, which has basically been turned into it's a piece of territory that's been basically turned into a war fighting machine by Hamas over the last, call it, decade and a half. Israel left in 2005, and within a few years after that, the war fighting machine that Israel unfortunately that was unfortunately unleashed on Israel on October 7th had been built over a number of years. And that includes many things. It includes, as you said, this labyrinth of underground tunnels. It's bigger in terms of miles than the London Underground. It's comparable in many ways to the New York City subway system in terms of its scale, hundreds of miles of 400 or 500 miles of tunnels underground, and that's where Hamas hides, plots, builds weapons, stores weapons. There's that capability. Then they have uh, extraordinary, have had not as much anymore. Extraordinary war chest, unbelievable weapons of all shapes and sizes and capabilities, and they have money. They have a lot of money, and they have the capacity to come and go from Gaza as they please. This is all possible because of what you just called the Philadelphia corridor, which was a military term applied by the ADF years ago when they were deciding what to do with this area when they left Gaza in 2005, which is it's about a 14-kilometer corridor in at the border between Gaza and Egypt, between Gaza and the Sinai. So so this area, it turns out, there's been a lot of smuggling through the corridor from Egypt and Sinai through the Sinai into Gaza, and then there's also 180 tunnels that Israel has found. There may be more, by the way. Israel's only just recently found 180 tunnels underneath the Philadelphia corridor. Again, these secret tunnels. So this is how Hamas has been able to get the capabilities into Gaza that enabled them to build this tunnel system. They needed cement trucks and cement and engineering resources, and just imagine what it takes to build a subway system. So how did all that get into Gaza? Isn't that interesting? Well, it came in. A lot of it came in through the Philadelphia corridor. A, B, weapons. Where did Hamas? How does the transport of weapons actually happen? Well, it turns out that it was all coming through the Philadelphia corridor. So the first thing is, if you're fighting an enemy, if you're trying to win a war, you can't do that while having their main supply line, their main supply route open. You have to shut it down, right? You can't be fighting a guerrilla war, a guerrilla enemy, and a guerrilla war fighting enemy, and have them be able to just have this supply route completely open 24/7. That's the first thing. The second thing is, when you're fighting a guerrilla war enemy, you do not want them to be able to leave. You want to win the war. The way you win the war is you capture them or you kill them, but you don't let them scatter. And lastly, there are hostages. There are still over 100 hostages in Gaza. You do not want Hamas to have the capacity to take those hostages out of Gaza. God knows where they'll wind up. There's been speculation that Hamas may at some point try to get some of the hostages out and get them into Iran. So For all those reasons, the Philadelphia corridor is a key, not the key. I'm not suggesting that it's the only metric for success in Israel's war against Hamas, but the idea that Israel can fight this war without having some plan for what it's going to do with the Philadelphia corridor is completely delusional.
I am talking with Dan Senor. He is the host of the Call Me Back podcast, which you should listen, like, follow, and tell everyone about because it is the best source of information. His array of guests span the Israeli political spectrum as well as observers from the United States and from England, as with Douglas Murray today. Now, I want to ask, there are 350 plus Israeli soldiers who have been killed in Gaza since the beginning of the war. Doesn't count the 10-7 casualties. Do they have an organization similar to the two organizations representing hostage families, one which is Ceasefire Now and one which is Tikva, which is not ceasefire? The hostages cannot be made the number one objective. There are two. We had 500,000 Israelis in the streets on Saturday. I'm just wondering if the families of the fallen soldiers have a voice, Dan Senor.
That's a good question. They're not organized in terms of the fallen soldiers of the Gaza war. Obviously, there are organizations in Israel that represent fallen soldiers generally, but there's not one that's specific to the Gaza fighting. At least not that I know of. I think I know where you're going with this, and I'll say that this is part of the tension within the protest movement generally, and between and within the hostage families movement, the hostages forum, they call it in Israel. And obviously, there's and let me just preface this by saying I don't having a loved one who is either fighting in Gaza or is being held in Gaza. As far as I'm concerned, you can say whatever you want, you can do whatever you want. I know many of these people. I know many families who have loved ones who have fought in Gaza, who have loved ones who were killed in Gaza, or who are being held hostage, or were held hostage and have since been killed. And I don't begrudge any of them, or I just could never question what they do.
Dan was the coalition authorities, provisional coalition authority spokesperson in Iraq during the war. So he knows what it's like to communicate on the mark, as he just did. So, Dan, I agree with you. You were saying hostage families, survivor families, fallen soldier families can say whatever they want. Well, I agree with that. And I've had Rachel Goldberg on this show before Hirsch was executed, and it was moving, so deeply moving. So I don't disagree with any of that, but I don't hear anything from families of fallen soldiers anywhere.
Yeah,
And I'm just wondering if they speak up.
So again, I can't emphasize it enough. Obviously, like you and I agree, Hugh, families who are suffering or trying to get their loved ones out could and should say whatever they want. My frustration is the media over here is focused exclusively on those voices that are just attacking Israel's government and just criticizing Israel's government, which they have every right to do. Meaning the protesters have every right to do. There are some within this community of either fallen soldiers or even some of the hostages who don't necessarily agree with what some others in the hostage movement or some others in Israeli society are advocating for. It's not as cohesive a movement as we would think. I had Maya Roman, who's a family member of a woman who was released in the first hostage deal and who's related to Carmel Gott, who was just killed along with Hirsch among the 6 hostages that were executed a little over a week ago. She was on my podcast a few months ago, and she made the point that, for instance, if you are a male soldier being held hostage in Gaza, you may not like some of these hostage deals being discussed because your loved one is probably not going to get released in the first phase. And if there's going to be a hostage deal, you want everyone to be released. You don't want these phased releases, because if they're keeping the male soldiers for a future date, it's safe to assume that there's a good chance they'll never be released, or it could be very long before they release. So they're not on board with some of what the hostage movement is advocating for. If you are a soldier, if you're a family member of a soldier fighting in Gaza, if the lesson from that Hamas takes away, that taking hostages yields enormous exchanges enormous benefits. Does that incentivize Hamas to take hostages in the future? If you're a soldier, if you're the loved one of a soldier fighting in Gaza, do you want to put your loved one to have that added risk that Hamas is looking at them as a potential hostage? So there's so many equities, Hugh. It's there's so many cross currents. There's so many different players and different people who have different concerns and different issues, and keeping track of it all is very hard. And I just think covering this issue the way the American media has been covering it, as though it's a monolith, it's this cohesive unit all calling for the same thing, I think is it doesn't give respect and fair coverage to what's really going on.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I appreciate Call Me Back, because you will often bring on people from both sides of every conversation, and there aren't just both sides, there are 30 sides. And if you're not listening to Call Me Back and you're listening to this podcast right now or tomorrow morning, you've got to, if you want to be smart about this war. And by the way, we got 2 carrier groups there, got 19 American ships. We could be in the war by the time you hear this. It is that kind of a hair trigger. Dan, I wouldn't have known about Habib Redick Gur, who is now often on this program without you. I wouldn't have known about Nadav Ayal. I wouldn't have known about all these people. But I also have to kind of guess on their politics. And after a year or 11 months, I think Haviv is the closest I've heard to an objective, completely, maybe center right, just a bit, journalist. And I think Nadav is a man of the left. And he's never said that. But when Nadav wouldn't answer your direct question in the penultimate podcast about Yair Lapid, which I did not know, I was shocked. I stopped. I was running, and I stopped, replayed it to hear it. He said that this coalition government is a murderer's government and that Netanyahu has blood on his hands. Did I hear that right? Because I was just shocked. You asked Nadal about that, and he avoided your question 3 times.
I think the rhetoric, Hugh, by some on the Israeli left, not all, some are being responsible. I just interviewed last night Benny Gantz at a conference in D.C., which is where I am right now. He was very responsible, even though he has strong disagreements with Netanyahu. I think some of the rhetoric among some on the Israeli left has gotten out of control, way too hot. And Lapid had resisted that for a while, and I'm disappointed to say he hasn't. The way some of these political leaders are talking about Netanyahu and others in the Israeli government, I think is blood on their hands. Murderers government. I mean, it's just I think we need to take a step back and remind people and remember Hamas orchestrated and executed this massacre. You can disagree with how the Israeli government has responded at various points, but let's not forget who the enemy is. And I think sometimes the rhetoric gets so heated. Yeah.
And I also
and by the way, Hugh, let me just tell you, it also hurts Israel over here. And that's the point I tried to make.
Yes.
In one of these conversations I had on the podcast, it hurts it hurts Israel over here, because I said I'm doing a series of TV interviews trying to defend Israel, trying to present Israel's dilemmas and challenges, which is what I try to do on my podcast too. And I push back at some of the people interviewing me. I won't mention names, but I push back on them saying, you do remember there's this organization called Hamas, right? It's like, what about Netanyahu this and Netanyahu that? So the Israeli government, its prime minister, are the obstacles to peace and prosperity out of this war. And I'm like, you do know there's this organization called Hamas, right? And they're like, look, Dan, we're just citing what some Israelis are saying in our questions. And in fairness to these reporters, they have a point. I think some of the Israelis who are taking to the streets are not thinking about Israel's image and the challenges Israel faces in the international arena and the impact they're having on it.
I co-moderated with Lester Holt and Kristen Welker the debate in November, and the first hour was devoted to the 10/7 massacre. And I hope tomorrow night, David Muir and Lindsay begin by asking, did Israel have the right to respond preemptively against Hezbollah? And if they see Iran doing the same thing they did in April, making the preparations to strike, does Israel have a right to hit Iran preemptively? because I'd like to know what Kamala Harris says about that. But our media will. I don't have a lot of hopes that Muir and Lindsay will ask good questions. Do you?
On this issue, no, but I don't want to judge until I see them perform. But look, we know that Kamala Harris uh, has been on the wrong side of most, not all, of most of the decisions that the administration has made since October 7th about how to deal with this war. And she's never been challenged on that. We know that Tim Walz, even as recently as last week, uh, expressed some views about Israel and where to go forward with this war that were shocking to me. No mention of Hamas, talking as though everything's on track to reach some sort of hostage deal and temporary ceasefire, but for Benjamin Netanyahu. Literally, I mean, you this interview he gave was jarring. So there are a lot of serious questions for what could be this future administration in terms of how it conducts itself with Israel, in the Middle East, and foreign policy more broadly. And I just hope this is addressed in the debate tomorrow.
I just want Dan to talk a little bit about first my statement about Netanyahu. I've only interviewed him once when Bibi came out, spent an hour with him. Fascinating career. I am very glad that he is the prime minister of Israel right now because he's the most experienced person with war and peace and making a bad decision and making good decisions. He lost a brother in a terrorist, a rescue of hostages held by terrorists in Entebbe. And I think Netanyahu has the experience necessary to deal with this situation in a way that maybe only uh, Bennett understands, Naftali Bennett. And maybe, yeah, and maybe Benny Gantz. But Benny Gantz hadn't been a prime minister yet. So I don't know that he knows everything that goes on. So what do you think of Netanyahu? I mean, obviously, like Churchill came back in World War II, and he had all the experiences and the mistakes of World War I to draw upon. I think Israel is well served by having an experienced cabinet right now. And then I have one last question after that, Dan.
Look, Netanyahu is very experienced. I know him well. I've known him for a long time. I think he's accomplished some extraordinary things for Israel and for the West. By the way, I think he's been an important voice on behalf of the West, not just Israel. I think that it's not about his smarts or capabilities or experience. I think he has all those things. I think that there is a breakdown in trust of Netanyahu right now among the Israeli public. I don't know, Hugh, how to repair that in wartime. But there's deep skepticism. For instance, that's why I did this recent episode on the podcast called Bibi's Message versus Bibi the Messenger. And this was this conversation that you were citing, which I had between Nadav Ayel and Amit Segel, two Israeli journalists, one from the right, one from, one's right, one Nadav, as you say, center left. He wouldn't call him that, but you and I can. I'm needling him a little bit here if he's listening. I was just with him last night in D.C. Look, the problem is the arguments Netanyahu is laying out, for instance, on the Philadelphia corridor, as we were talking about earlier, are very, very reasonable. And in fact, a lot of Israelis agree with what he's saying. But there's been some kind of breakdown where he can't break through. He can't persuade. And so the question is why. Now, that could change. Maybe with more success, that can change. But right now, he's been a little stuck. And so I think it's not just about his capabilities, which I think he has. It's not just about his experience, which I think he has in spades. It's not even about his vision, which I think he has. The question is, do you reach a point where when you've served in office so long, think Margaret Thatcher, there was just a point at which, for all her experience and all her talent and all her vision, the public, and including the Tories in the UK, just were exhausted by her, and we're ready for a change. And so I do think there's something akin to that going on right now in Israel.
Well, if he were to declare,
obviously exacerbated by October 7th, which goes without saying, that
if he were to declare, Dan, that he's going to finish this government and he's not running again, but he is going to finish this government, and this government is rock solid. It's got 64 seats out of 120. It's not going anywhere until 2026 or 2027. So get used to it. I'm here, and we're not going anywhere. And you got the far right, hard right parties who agree with him on that. I would like that, but that I have to add one question. John Podhoretz last week, and I listened to every commentary podcast as well, said it was his belief that Yoav Gallant's spirit is broken. That he doesn't think the war can be won, and he wants to get out of Gaza to the extent possible, repair, get ready for the war in Lebanon. I don't know what to think about that statement because Gallant has been a lion. What do you think about John's statement that he believes Gallant's spirit is broken?
I don't think Gallant's spirit is broken. I think Gallant, from the beginning of this war, was a big believer in the idea that Israel should go to the north first and deal with Hamas and Gaza later. That they needed to surprise Hezbollah in the north. That ultimately Hezbollah was the bigger threat to Israel. 10 times the capabilities, 10 times the weapons, 10 times the personnel. Not just the number of weapons, the 200,000 rockets, but the sophistication of some of those capabilities, precision guided, could really wreak havoc in central Israel. That it was inevitable that Hezbollah was going to follow Hamas, and Israel should preempt and strike Hezbollah. And so I think Gallant believes that Israel's reached a point where it really needs to focus on the north, and it needs to kind of put Gaza to bed, so to speak, for now, and focus on Hezbollah. So I just think he's frustrated from a strategic standpoint. I don't think he's lost his spirit, or he's I don't agree with John on that.
Okay, that's what I wanted to know because I trust both you and John a lot on these subjects. Last question. I want you to try, and it's impossible because he's a sociopath, to think like Senor. You execute 6 hostages, one of them an American citizen as well as an Israeli citizen. We've mentioned Hirsch. And 500,000 Israelis turn out to yell at Netanyahu. Doesn't that tell Senor that the next best move is to execute 12 hostages and get 1,000,000 Israelis in the street? I don't understand it, Dan. It befuddles me. It leaves me wondering, don't they realize Senor is watching?
I'm stunned by this, Hugh. I the degree to which this was just a total disregard for the U.S. and basic disrespect for the U.S. in the sense that, like, we don't care what the U.S. thinks. Um, was shocking to me. Many believed that Israel, uh, that Sinwar is not intimidated by Israel and is happy to have a fight with Israel, but is concerned about the U.S. And the U.S. has a certain level of indirect influence on Sinwar. I don't. I mean, just the hostage video they released of Hirsch Goldberg, Poland. It was like geared. It felt to me like in many respects it was geared towards an American audience, and specifically the American administration. And so I think we need to wake up here. We here in the U.S. that this is a terror organization that's not intimidated by the United States.
And I'll close with this. Keep doing what you're doing. I think it's very difficult to do public events, and I appreciate your courage in doing them right now because I was up in Harvard Yard during the summer. I'm very deeply ashamed of my alma mater. I would be very afraid to be a Jewish student on a elite campus right now. I think there are bad people on all these campuses, and I'm glad you're out there spreading the word. But I think Call Me Back is vital at this point, Dan. So good luck in your conversation tonight with Dave McCormick. When you bring people along and doing all these public events, and people should subscribe to Call Me Back. Anything I have left off that you want to add?
No, no, I appreciate it. Just if you're in the Philly area tonight, 8 o'clock p.m. with Dave, as you said, and September 24th in New York City at the Stryker Center, a live recording of Call Me Back, and we'll keep promoting these events as they come up.
Good. I'll talk to you in a month or so. Dan Senor, thank
All
you
right,
so
Hugh.
much. Follow him
Thanks
on
for everything you're
X.
doing.
You bet. Bye bye.